Well, we are especially privileged and honored to have Bishop Timothy Clarke with us as a very special guest. And I want to, first of all, thank you because you have been just phenomenal to this PhD program, African American Preaching and Sacred Rhetoric. Remember several years ago, I called together a group of pastors. You came and gave us input. Then after that, you and I went to lunch. We went to lunch at Branch's conference
in Detroit, that's right.
And I was trying to figure out how I could reach the African American church to help raise funds for the program, and you just locked in with an idea. Then we did Booth's conference,
right,
and then we had dinner again. Not only we had lunch, we had lunch at your place. You fixed lunch for me.
That's right.
You fixed lunch for me.
Well, I didn't fix it, but yeah, right. I ordered it to be fixed.
And you are a part of the inaugural donor pool for this program and the inaugural donor. So it is our blessed and special privilege to have you, because you have just played a huge role, and I want to thank you and your church.
Amen.
For just really, really helping us. And so I want to talk about preaching with you, because you're a phenomenal preacher. And so a lot of our audience knows who you are and are aware of your ministry. So what would you like, those that might not know you, what would you say to them?
Well, before I do that, let me say, and I think you already know it, without this sounding like a mutual admiration society, how happy I am to be here. Really happy, humbled, honored by it. You already know the affection and the affinity, admiration that I have for you. It's sort of like with the Queen of Sheba, with Solomon, heard of you in the hearing of the ear, from Bob Cope and Charles Booth and Sterling Cope and all of these people, Johnny Youngblood, always talk about Frank Thomas, Frank Thomas. And then when we got to meet in Chicago at a Urban Ministries, we were both on to speak, and we just sort of click from there, and it's been a joy. You are really, I've said this in your absence, so I can say it in your presence, one of my favorite preachers. What you do to a text is, it makes me want to go buy another Bible, because mine doesn't read that way. I'm like, they cheated me. So I am just happy to be with you. Who am I? That's a great question. I think most people know, or people who've heard me preach know, that I'm a native New Yorker, born in Brooklyn, the borough of Brooklyn. I grew up in Far Rockaway, which is in Queens, and then moved to Manhattan because our mother worked for Columbia University School of Social Work, so we ultimately moved to Manhattan, nearer her job. My mom and dad were never married, so I'm the product of a relationship outside of the bonds of what we call, when I was a kid, without the benefit of clergy, which was a nice way of being something else. And so grew up in that situation, but unique. My story is so at times in juxtaposition, because grew up in a situation where my mom and dad were not married, but I grew up in the church. Grew up in an environment, in a church that nurtured me. I often tell people I believe in the church and I believe in preaching because those two things saved my life. My pastor, my childhood pastor, who I called Dad, he's in heaven now, I eulogized him some years ago. I called him Dad. He was really like my father. He nurtured me. The saints in that church nurtured me. They stirred up the gifts that were in me. You know, you grew up in church, so you know in Chicago, you grow up in doing Easter recitations and Christmas speeches and all of that. And so it was really there that I first developed my love for language, my ability to speak. And then you got to remember, like you, I grew up in the 60s. And the 60s had a plethora of articulate, dynamic men and women. Martin King, Adam Clayton Powell, Malcolm X, Shirley Chisholm. You could just go on and on. John Kennedy, you can't, Churchill was still alive. You can't live in that atmosphere where the spoken word is so powerful and it not impact you. Then I was born in New York. Yep. Should I say more? No. Gardner Taylor, Sandy Ray, William Augustus Jones, Hilton Lancaster James, please. It was almost like I had no choice. Necessity was laid upon me. Yes, sir.
You know, Jeffrey Johnson, in a previous interview, I was talking to him, and he said, I didn't flunk my exposure.
Listen, I lived up to the exposure. God will not hold me for not doing the best I could with my exposure. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So talk to me about preaching mentors. So give me some of the preaching mentors.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, I'm Church of God. But again, I was talking about Dad Craig. Dad was a unique individual, as you know, because you're familiar with the Church of God. We can tend to be very cloistered, very sequestered, very much to ourselves. Dad was such a different spirit. Some of his dearest friends were Baptist, Church of God in Christ pastors, Methodists. In fact, I tease people who say, I'm an ecumenist. I say, y'all didn't see an ecumenist if you never met Dad. Because Brotherhood Sunday, Dad would have a Catholic priest. One year, Rabbi Joel Zion from Temple Israel. I'll never forget. He would have priests and rabbis preach for us on Brotherhood Sunday. So I was exposed through him to a plethora of preaching styles and preaching personalities. Again, living in New York, you know, we could go hear any of them. He said, come on, let's go over and hear Gardner. Or Sandy's preaching over here, let's go hear him. So I was able to be exposed, and all of those men became mentors and models for me in preaching, because I heard such a wide variety of styles, such a wide variety of approaches, such a wide variety to handling a text and carving out a ministry. Because some of those men were known strictly as preachers, some were known as church builders, some were known as national civil rights leaders, some were known as convention men. So I saw ministry in all of its varied shades, as well as the preaching style.
I want to back up, because you haven't called Dad's name.
Yeah.
His whole name.
Yes.
And I was in your office, and
yes,
you pointed to that picture on the wall,
yes, sir.
And the tears began to run. So I want you to call his name.
Yeah, they're starting now, which is probably why I didn't call his name. James Eula Craig. And his picture hangs in my office. And many a day I look at it and smile, because he saw in me. I really do believe, Frank, if it hadn't been for him, his influence on my life, I would have gotten caught up in the vortex and the pathology of New York City. But God used him to anchor me.
Yeah. I just wanted to call it, because I know just from being with you in your office and talking about it, what the meaning there, and it's, you know, of course, the power of the Black church, the role of the pastor, the preaching, all of that is expressed. So I want you to call his name.
Thank you. I do it every chance I get.
So, yes, okay, now let's go back. So you started with him as a mentor. So let's keep going. And
so started with him. He baptized me, dedicated me, baptized me, licensed me, ordained me, married me, installed me in both of my churches, buried everybody in my family. The last person he buried, not long before he passed, was my baby sister. He buried all my grandparents, my aunts, my mother, and then my baby sister was the last one of us that he sent home. A few years later, I sent him home.
That's an old school pastor. Oh. That's an old school pastor.
Yes, sir.
Old school.
Sir. It's so funny. You know, I used to have those family Bibles. You look in our family Bible, his name was on everything. All the wedding programs, all the funeral, all the baby daddy, he did them all. I can see his handwriting right now on all of them. Yeah.
So would you say that you pastor in that style?
Wow, yes. And let me tell you a story about that. Our church was maybe 300-400 people. Because you got to remember, back in those days, there wasn't the push for mega churches like there is now. You know, Convent Avenue up in Harlem, where Jesse Williams is now at that time. Dr. Wilson was there, Manny Wilson, M.L. Wilson was there, of course, Abyssinian, you know, Concord, Cornerstone, Bethany. You had some big churches. but nothing like what you have now. And so in those days, the pastoral paradigm was different. It really was. A lot of those churches didn't even have staff. You know, pastor went to the office on Wednesdays and Sundays, funerals and weddings, take off his jacket, put on his robe. He didn't keep office hours. It was more of, matter of fact, we used to laugh. If you wanted dad to counsel you, you came to the house. 2123 Birdsall Avenue. He had a study there. That's where he counseled. He didn't counsel at the church. He went to the church to preach, to teach, to do what had to be done. So my style of pastoring was predicated on that. So when First Church really started growing, I would always say, you know, you do this. What would Dad do? What would Dad do? One day I'm sitting in my desk, this issue that I have to deal with, and I say, what would Dad do? And no sooner than I said it, a voice, I believe it was the Lord, said to me, he wouldn't know what to do because he never pastored anything this big. In one moment I laughed, the other moment I cried, because I realized in a way I had gone to a place he couldn't help me. And that was heartbreaking because the comfort is I can always look at what he would do. And now I had to chart my own path. I had to make my own discoveries, and I had to learn at another level. So yeah, but I still have one of the hardest things for me to do, even at a church outside, is to let go of that. Because in here is still the heart of a pastor who wants to. I just got an email about one of our members who had surgery today. They found a blockage, and his son-in-law, who's one of our deacons, just texted me and said they couldn't remove the blockage. And so 12 to 18 months. And you know, so I'm sitting here, I said, well, I'm in Indianapolis, but I'll stop by either tonight or tomorrow. So I still, even though we have people on staff who do it, I still try to do it when I can. Wow. Yeah.
So yeah, having been there and, you know, of course, been with your people, it's evident.
Well, you know, yeah.
It's evident, it's evident, evident. Now let's go back to preaching mentors, because you're a phenomenal preacher, so we want to know, besides Dad, who were some of the other influences?
Sure. I could run that. How much time do we have? Well, you know, of course, there's Dad. And I want to just start with a circle. In Far Rockaway, we had First Church of God, where I grew up, First Baptist Church, the Reverend Dr. H. Oliver Scott Sr. Now, I'll tell you a story about that. You know Philip Pointer? That's Philip's maternal grandfather.
Oh, you serious? Wow.
Philip's mother and I grew up together.
Wow.
Yeah, so his grandfather, who I call Pop Scott, was at First Baptist. Kelly Temple, Church of God in Christ, was Pop Kelly, Elder Howard Kelly, whose son and I were like brothers, who's now my executive pastor in Columbus. So he's there. Then down the road was Bethel AME. Old man Donald Benjamin Barton, West Indian man, was there for like 100 years. And then when he retired, the bishop sent a gentleman by the name of James F. Leith, Pop Leith. He came with his wife, a daughter named Caprice that we called Cappy, and a son named Jeffrey. Jeffrey N. Leith, who's now a bishop in the AME Church. All of us grew up together. So all of those men were preaching mentors when I was a kid, because I literally heard them every week. They swapped pulpits, funerals, different things. Then you go to Brooklyn and you have the men I talked about. In Jamaica was a man by the name of Walter Stockholm Penn, who pastored Calvary Baptist. Great businessman, entrepreneur, civic leader. You had James Moore at Amity Baptist in Jamaica. In Brooklyn, you had a man named Evans Bromley Marshall, Lafayette Avenue Church of God. Just, again, West Indian, a Bible preacher, teacher. In the national church, men like Marcus Morgan, Benjamin Reed, Bob Cope, you know, Sam Hines, of course, Doc Massey, who we just buried last Saturday. So all of those men were mentors and models for me in preaching. Yeah, I cut my teeth listening to those guys.
So how would you describe your preaching style?
That's good. Now, be honest with you, one of the things that has frustrated me inwardly about my preaching is I don't have a style. I wish I listened to guys like Booth, you know, or Branch, and you know how they're going to come at it. You just know they got a trademark style. I don't. There's some days that my preaching is almost totally teaching. In some settings, I intentionally do that. Then there are times when I am very, very celebratory. I wish I could some guys can just do it. They have honed it and they fine-tuned it. I've never been able to do that. Now, you know what I blame it on? I blame it on the plethora of streams that flowed into me when I was a kid. So I took a little bit of everybody. Now the benefit is I'm comfortable in many settings. I can adjust. I'm not a chameleon. I don't fake it, but the Lord has allowed me to adjust. Years ago, there was a man in our church named Wendell Boyd, who was the chair of our trustee board. And we called him Uncle Pudgy. His wife's name was Virginia Boyd. We called her Auntie Baby. They didn't have children, so they spoiled all the kids in the church. Uncle Pudgy, Auntie Baby. And I remember one time Dad Cray was talking about Uncle Pudgy. He said, Wendell is like a monkey wrench. He'll fit anywhere you put him. And I never forgot that because he loved him so much. He said, Wendell's like a monkey wrench. You know, you can turn that thing on the monkey wrench, it'd go bigger. And I think in many ways, my preaching is like a monkey wrench. I'm able to fit in almost anywhere. Yeah.
So then you would not categorize narrative, expository, all these?
Some of all, yeah. There are times I'm very narrative. Now, I lean towards expository because I truly, fully believe in the exegetical work of a text. Expository, exegetical, common is the prefix ex, pulling out of. So I fully believe in that. Now, there are some, and I need to be careful saying this in the chapel of the seminary, there are some who I think too narrowly constrict and constrain expository preaching. Because I think you can be narrative. Give you a case in point, E.K. Bailey, who was narrative, but my God, what an exegete. Right. You know, same thing. Now, A. Lewis Patterson was strictly what it would be termed pure classical expository, not just verse by verse. Doc would do word by word. You know, he got through with the Westcott Hoyt. When you was worried about letter by letter. Now what that letter mean? So you had those, both of them, you know, from Texas. One was strict at it with a little bit of flavor to it. Doc wasn't a hooper, he was a growler. Doc Patterson would growl. You know, but then you had E.K. Bailey who could do that. I fell in love with a prostitute. You know, that whole thing on Hosea and Gomer. And do the narrative, but would be exegeting.
First person too. Yeah.
Come on. Yes. Then of course you look at C.L. Franklin, who, you know, Doc Branch is an expert on that, both by proximity and because of his study of him. And you know, I was telling somebody the other day, funniest thing, the vice chairman of my deacon board, we were talking one Sunday morning and before service, and he said something about Dr. Franklin. So I kind of looked at him, he said, yeah. He said, I was listening to some of his stuff on, not for YouTube the other day, and I'm like looking at him, and he said, man, that guy could preach. So I said, well, you know, I said, Rand, most people, and this is where we owe a debt to Branch, only listen to Doc for those last 7 minutes. But if you listen to Doc that whole sermon, he was saying something. Listen, he could keep the 7 minutes for me. The way he would deal with a passage and then blend sociological, geopolitical realities, cultural things. Nobody, other than when Doc started it, really is giving Doc the credit that he deserves. C.L. Franklin was a mind.
Yes, he was.
He was a mind.
Yes, he was.
Yeah.
Yes, he was. And I hope that you know that, part of the legacy that you're contributing to is a dissertation on C.L. Franklin. So thank you for that. That's
Man, it's and let me say how excited we are about that. I didn't realize we were the inaugural person in the inaugural group. But man, that money that we give, that we've committed to, is some of the easiest money for us to give. Because I say to our church every year when we honor our graduates, I say, don't forget, we're also supporting the very first PhD in African American rhetoric and preaching. I said, that's something big.
Thank you.
That's something big, and we owe a debt of gratitude to you for that.
And we owe a debt of gratitude to you because there's going to be a dissertation on C.L. Franklin.
I'm so excited about that.
So tell me about how you prepare a sermon.
It's a great word. I mentioned Dr. Samuel George Hines, who pastored 3rd Street, where Cheryl Sanders serves. He was Cheryl's pastor for almost all of her life. And she succeeded him when he passed away. He died suddenly, and she succeeded him. Years ago, I heard Pop Hines talk about, the first time I ever heard D. Martin Lloyd-Jones' name was from the lips of Samuel George Hines. He was from Jamaica, and he had gone to London during a period of crisis in his faith, and he kind of stumbled upon Westminster Chapel and heard Doc preach on Sunday nights. He became a devotee and an advocate of serious preaching. And when I listened to him talk about, I was not serious, because Dad wasn't a serious preacher. But for some reason, when I heard Pop Hines talk about serious preaching, did two things. Maybe first of all, go get everything I could on and by D. Martin Lloyd-Jones. And the second thing, it made me try serious preaching. And I started that in Warren 100 years ago, and I'm still doing it. So the way I prepare really is a little bit different from a man or a woman, one of our preaching brothers or sisters, who does more preaching each week on a different theme or different text. I know where I'm going. So when I know where I'm going, like I'm looking at next year doing a thing on Christians and the culture. And so I've already started reading and outlining and scribbling and looking for things. So I have a much longer runway because I do so much serious preaching. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I spend a lot of time reading. I'm a strong advocate in this. Don't go to the commentaries until you've thought yourself through it. I think the curse, especially for young preachers, but Frank, I'm like the psalmist. I once was young, but now I'm old. I think it's also a curse for old preachers because we can get lazy. And it's much easier to go pull down something and just doctor it up, work on it, Clarkenize it, Thomasize it, whatever you want to call it. So I tell preachers, don't do that first. Sit with the text, live with the text, pray over the text, muse over it. I never forget, one day I came home from school, Dad was sitting on the porch, 2123 Birdsall Avenue. He was sitting on the porch in his rocking chair. And I was sitting there looking, I thought to myself, this is the life. He just sits there. And so I said to him, I said, Dad, his Bible was open, but he wasn't reading it. He was just sitting in the rocking chair, Bible open. I said, what are you doing? I never forget what he said. He never stopped rocking. He looked at me and said, thinking, and went right back to rocking. I just stood there for a minute. He looked up and said, thinking. And that taught me something. Because a lot of times, Frank, preachers don't think. We let others think for us. And when you rush to those commentaries or you buy that book of sermons at the convention, you're not thinking. And there is, if what Phillips Brooks says about preaching is true, that it is truth through human personality, emanating from, permeating through a human personality, you have to be engaged in some thinking of your own. Now, the flip side of that, and I struggle with this, is not desiring to be novel. See, one of the challenges of preaching I hear today is almost this competition to come up with something no one has said before, which is scary. That's very, I don't know if I want to hear something nobody else has said before, because not only does it lend towards real eisegesis, I think it lends towards abuse of not only the text but the pulpit. We are preaching what has been handed down to us. And I think when you don't do that, you make a grave mistake. So I spend a lot of time in study, praying, musing, reflecting, looking, researching. I'll read various translations of it. And then by that time, and I guess you would know this, by that time, when I go to the commentary, it's for either one of two things, clarity or confirmation. Maybe three, correction. Yeah. You know, so I go to the commentaries for clarity. Am I really approaching this right? Confirmation, I'm on the right path, or correction. That's not what this text says. Now, I can't tell you how many times I've deleted, or back in the old day, torn up a whole manuscript because about 4 pages in, I say to myself, that's not what this is about. And that takes courage because you don't put a lot of sweat equity in that. But I'm not going to get up there if I can't be true to it. That for me is the key.
So are you manuscript or non-manuscript?
Again, I'm eclectic. I'm a little bit of both. Now, Dad was strict manuscript. Dad wrote every word. So when I started preaching, Dad used to put his sermons in manila folders. We'd go on Saturday to the stationery store and he'd stock up on manila folders. So when I started preaching, what did I do? Put my sermons in a manila folder. Didn't have as many pages as him, but I had pages. He would turn those pages and till he found his spot, and then off he'd go. So I was a manuscript preacher, and I still write it out because I love the discipline of sermon preparation. I love that as much as I love preaching almost. I tell people, if I ever preach as good in the pulpit as I do in the study, it's going to be bedlam. It's going to be the fallout of the theophany. If I ever get it as good up there as I did in there. So I love it. So, but I hardly ever refer to it, you know, because I internalize it. Now, Booth, you know, memorizes his. I don't memorize it, but I've got a great memory. So chunks of it. The other thing is I see a sermon sort of like a play. So I'm turning the pages in my head and seeing the actors and the scenes unfolding in my mind, which helps me have continuity.
So what would you say is the genius of black preaching?
I think there's several. Years ago, I don't know if you were a contributor to this, the Africana Bible. I never forget, I was working on an Advent series. And I could take you to my study in my old house. I was working on this Advent series, and I opened up the Africana Study Bible and the commentary. And it dealt with that whole out of Egypt, headed to Egypt with the baby Jesus, headed to Egypt. And I said, okay, that's good, I got that. And I looked in another European commentary. It said nothing about it in that regard. And that night it hit me how different the hermeneutic of those two cultures are. So the first thing I would say is the genius of black preaching hermeneutically is so powerful. It's like our Negro spirituals. Didn't my Lord deliver Daniel? Deliver Daniel, deliver. Didn't our Lord deliver Daniel? Then why not every man? we could see whatever God did with Daniel or with Israel in Exodus. We could see us. That's for me, that's the theological. The sociological, and perhaps the psychological too, is black preaching preached us off the brink of jumping off of the bridge. Homicide and suicide. Black preaching saved us from homicide and suicide. It saved our race. You look back at those old, John Jasper, look back at him. But you look back at men like Lacey Kirk Williams, Julius Caesar Austin, J.H. Jackson. You got to remember the times in which they preached. I'm doing a series now called out of John chapter 5 where Jesus engages the man at the pool of Bethesda. And I've called this series Getting Back on Your Feet. Because the text doesn't say the man was born lame. It said he had been that way 38 years, which means there was a point, a place, a period in his personal pilgrimage when he had been on his feet. Something had knocked him off his feet. Life knocks us off our feet. Jesus gets that man back up on his feet, which is what the gospel does for us. Those men, most of them men in that era, you had in the Holiness, United Holy Church, Mount Sinai, Fire Baptized Holiness, you had women preachers, Baptists, some Methodists, most of them didn't. Most of them, it was mostly men. Those men preached black folk back up on their feet every Sunday after being beat down all week long. So hermeneutically, sociologically, psychologically, the genius of black preaching, it's amazing.
I want you to tell me about a time when you thought God really used you. We have a lot of humility as preachers.
Yes, right, sure we do.
But every now and then, we know God used us.
Yes, sir.
So give me the time when you knew.
Wow. There have been times, I remember a state convention I did in North Carolina when I preached that text where Paul says, bring John Mark, for he's profitable to me. And Frank, you've had it. It was one of those out-of-body experiences. I saw myself preaching. I was standing over there looking at myself preaching. That's why you can't take any glory, because you know it's not you. That was one. There have been times at First Church when, as Dr. Taylor used to say, when it's as if heaven bends down and kisses the service. It's happened at First Church. It's my favorite place to preach. I've preached all over the world. Preaching at First Church is still that's my sweet spot. So there have been times away and there have been times there when it is truly a God moment. It is, and here's the thing, without being in any way sacrilegious or in any way being pretentious, it is incarnational. It really, it's an incarnational moment. Really, his presence, I think it was Dr. Ray that said it. It doesn't happen every Sunday, but every now and then, he comes in the room. Not every, he said, doesn't happen at Cornerstone every Sunday, but every now and then. But here's what's wonderful. Even on the Sundays it doesn't, he still blesses.
Yes.
He still blesses.
Tell me about a time when preaching was difficult, tough, that it was just tough.
Sure. I've been at this. I preached my initial sermon first Sunday in January 1974. So I've been at this a long time. And there have been ebbs and flows. I don't know, Frank, ministry is a song of life. It's just like life. You have your seasons, you have your happy days. It's sort of like the seasons and cycles. You have winter, spring, summer, fall. Only thing is when you do it as long as we have, you go through it over and over and over again. I think some of the toughest times for me have been the loss of significant people. My mother died. In the same year, my mother died in February. Mom Cray, Dad's wife, died in August at the convention, dropped dead. So that was 88. That was a tough time. When Dad passed, when my baby sister passed, those were all tough times. With my baby sister, I felt like, I'm in Ohio, she's in New York, and I felt like I let my mother down because I couldn't be there as much as I wanted to be. So I had to work through that. There have been times when, in the heat of ministry, it's just tough. Building times, you're worried about the finances, growth, am I losing a grip on this? Times of my own weakness. All of us are called to preach beyond what we live. It's one of the strangest parts of preaching. I am called to preach the truth, even when that truth isn't being exhibited in my life. I can't water it down to accommodate me. So I must stand and herald and trumpet what I am convicted of myself. And sometimes, I think when the prophets talk about the burden of Duma and the hand of the Lord, oh, Lord, put your hand on me. I want to say, I don't think you get it. Leave God alone. You don't want, because that press and pressure that comes makes you cry out like Paul, who is sufficient for this? And there have been some seasons when I just plowed in faith, man. I sowed in faith, and I couldn't let my feelings, because I don't know if you've ever had this happen to you. Sometimes I could be driving to church, and I look over and see somebody doing something, and I think, that's not too bad a job. I could do that. I did digging it. That don't look too bad. It has this, I'm outside all day. But you know what that is? It's because two things. Number one, when that man gets through digging that ditch or laying that pipe or painting that house, whatever you say, or standing there, I can stand at Walmart, say, welcome to Walmart. I'm a very friendly person, I can do that. When I take off that blue smock or take off that hard hat, I go home and nobody's gonna bother me about that job till the next morning. And that's something we don't get in ministry. Years ago, I psychoanalyzed myself. That's a dangerous thing to do, but I did it. Because there were three things I thoroughly enjoyed doing. I enjoyed shining my shoes, I enjoyed washing my car, and I enjoyed cutting the grass. And one day I asked myself, why did I enjoy those three things so much? You know what came back to me? Because when you're finished, it's done and it stays that way. In ministry, nothing stays the way. You give your heart to preaching. You don't know whether they heard it or not. You don't know whether they will be changed by it or not. You pour your life into people, they'll walk away from you like you never met them. Nothing in ministry is sure until we get to heaven. Think of it, friend. Nothing. If I could one day walk out my office and know everything is going to be like this tomorrow morning when I come back, I'd sleep better. I know that while I'm walking in my car, in the words of Chiwana Chibi, things are falling apart. While I'm walking to my car, things are falling apart. So you got to preach through that. The frustration of it, sometimes the fear, sometimes the fatigue. The 3 F's of ministry. Frustration, fatigue, fear. They get all of us. They get all of us.
Did you preach your mom's funeral?
No, I couldn't. I couldn't. Dad did hers, Dad did Josephine's. I couldn't. I think sometimes, Frank, and I hope nobody who's done it will be met. I don't mean anything by it. I think sometimes we've got to be the mourner. I think sometimes we got to be the son or the daughter. So sometimes we just need to, you know, we preach this all the time. We need to sit where they sit. So the next time you preach a funeral, you look out at that first, second, third row, and you can say, I've sat there, not sat there and got up and preached. I sat there and struggled through it like you're doing right now. I sat there and cried my way through it. Because I think sometimes in the preaching, it gives us a chance to show we're strong. And sometimes you just need to be weak. Sometimes, so I didn't want to do Dad's funeral. Tell you a story about that. Dad had a best friend, Dr. Marcus Harold Morgan, Emerald Avenue Church of God in Chicago. They were Pete, repeat, frickin' frack. Dad always said, I want Doc to do my funeral. So one year, he called me in January. He said, when you coming to see me? I said, well, Dad, I said, I've got King services, and then I'm going to Florida to play golf. I said, you know, I go every year. He said, okay. He said, so when did you say you coming to see me? I go back through it again. He says, oh, okay. He said, so now when did you say you coming to see me? I said, Dad, I'll be there next week. So I fly to New York, stay at the house. That evening, that afternoon, he said, I want to talk to you tonight. I said, okay. So one of my friends came by. We went out to eat. I got home like 12:30, 1:45. Like a kid, I'm tipping in the house. Dad is sitting in his study. I said, you still up? He said, I told you I wanted to talk to you. Them old men were something. He said, sit down. I said, yes, sir. He said, I've been thinking, I want you to do my funeral. First thing I said was, I thought you wanted Doc Moore. He said, Doc's my best friend, but you're my son. I want you to do it. Then I said, I can't do that, Dad. I said, I can't. And this is his words to me. This is how you know somebody's your father. He said, you can and you will. Now go to bed. Got up, pulled his bathrobe around him and went on in the room. You can and you will. Now go to bed. And I got through it. I preached that text about David, who served his generation by the will of God, fell asleep. It's hard. It was hard. I did real good till the end. I did real good. I fell apart, but it was all right. Yeah. He knew I was probably going to do it, but I did it. You can and you will.
You know, what I'm struck by is what we call our best sermon. Sometimes to stand in front of a casket. You know, I had a preacher in St. Louis whose daughter died, and hemorrhage, brain hemorrhage, and matter of fact, it was the last night of the revival. He didn't come to the revival. She had that very night. Wow. So that next Tuesday night, he got up and preached, and it wasn't his best stuff. But I said, just to get up there. Now, just to get up there.
Listen, I don't know how he did it.
Yeah, just get up.
I don't know how he did it. I've lost mother, father, grandparents, siblings. I don't know how he did it.
And I appreciate your comment. It's a personal choice.
Yes, sir.
It's a personal choice.
For some people, it's catharsis. You know, it's catharsis. They work their way through it. For me, now this is weird. My healing came listening to my dad preach it. He had been our childhood pastor. He had married my mother to the man who she married after my father, because her and my dad were never married. He had done the weddings of all my aunts. He had buried my grandparents. He was the pastor of my family. And so for hearing his voice made it better. Hearing his voice. I remember when Josephine died, my baby sister. He was older, and I said, Dad, I want you to do Fiend's funeral. When I called to tell him Josephine had died, he broke down, started crying. He had helped raise all of us. And he did a good job. He was older. He could have said, Mary had a little lamb, wouldn't have bothered him. It was his voice. It was him standing there. I think we forget that as pastors. You know, here at the seminary, y'all teach on the ministry of presence. And let me tell you, sometimes just walking in the room is enough. You don't have to really say anything. You walk in, you're present. If you've been a real shepherd, if you've truly pastored those people, you don't need to say a word. Pastor's here. That's all it takes. That's all it takes.
Tell me what you think is going on in preaching today. There's a lot of discussion of what's going on in African American preaching today. What's going on?
I don't want to be caustic. I don't want to be accusatory. I don't want to even be hypercritical. I'm concerned about it. Now, let me say this. I am unapologetically a child of the 60s. So I cut my teeth on a certain kind of preaching, and I hold all preaching to that standard. I am concerned that a lot of the preaching isn't theological, in the sense that it does honor to the tradition. I never forget. This is funny, but it makes the point. I was talking to a young preacher about reading the Fathers. He said, oh yeah, like, you know Bishop Charles Harrison Mason, right? Like Dad Mason, and he called another one old preacher and another devil. I said, no, I mean the Fathers. They don't even know. They don't even know. Their reference list stops about 1970, if not 90. They know the current. Here's the other thing. They compare themselves among themselves. See, when you and I, one of the stories I remember is you telling about Dr. in Chicago, Curry.
Yeah, L.K. Curry.
L.K. Curry at that funeral of your friend.
Yes.
See, when we were growing up, we looked to those older men. We ain't talk about each other. We knew we couldn't preach. Like, please. We look to those fathers, those giants. This generation doesn't. They don't know them and don't feel the need to. Because they talk among themselves. Don't laugh, Frank. Is that, in the words of Michael Tyson, that's ludicrous. How do you do that? What are you going to learn? What are you going to give each other? Wow. My well is this deep, your well is that deep. What are we going to drink? Somebody got to go to a deeper well. I'm through. You're going to get me, see the one chance I get to be on here, and I done messed up now. But somebody has to go to a deeper well. This is where we're drinking, right here. Doc, you preach that, Doc. Like, go, both of you, go sit down. Both of you.
Somebody done preached that text for 2,000 years.
And they have no idea. Right. They don't know Chrysostom. Right. They don't know Augustine. Right. They don't know Hippo. They don't know nothing. They don't know where Hippo is. They don't know the fathers. They don't know Julia Norwich. They don't know them. And they're all right with it. You know, Dr. Taylor had this great line. Dr. Taylor was a funny guy. He and Dr. Proctor could be funny in a dry kind of way. This preacher was doing something real foolish. And somebody brought it to Dr. Taylor's attention. Dr. Taylor looked over at him, looked back, and said, "You can be so happy when you don't know." That sums it up. When you don't know, you can be doing something real stupid and think you're looking great. That's right. You can be so happy when you don't know. And that's what I think sometimes happens. So when I listen to a lot of modern preaching, I just wonder, what are they drinking from? What well, what stream, what's feeding them? It can't just be their peers. You know, I've listened to the interviews. Man, you listen to Freddie Haynes, listen to Jeffrey. You know, you're going to have F. Bruce on in a little while, Doc Branch. Those guys, every one of us will talk about those men before us. We didn't drink from each other's well. Do that? No. We were all trying to go to the well. We were all trying to drink from something that was flowing, that we sensed was deep. Right. And that's my concern about where preaching is today.
Tell me the most powerful sermon that you've ever heard.
Ooh. Now, can I give you a couple of them? Yeah. Okay. My dad preached one time. There's several of them, but the one I most remember was his Advent sermon when I was a teenager. I can still remember the text, Genesis 49:10. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh comes. And unto him shall the gathering of the people be. He preached on when Shiloh comes, and he drew a line from Genesis 49 all the way to the Nativity. It was a thing of beauty. And everything that wasn't standing up was laying down. It was bedlam. But he argued it from Genesis with the promise all the way to Matthew 1:21. Stopped by Isaiah, went by Job. He went all through the Bible, tracking Jesus to get him to that place in Bethlehem. That was one of the great sermons. I think one of the greatest sermons I ever heard was Dr. Taylor's two-part sermon, Church of the Lord of the Church. See, you got to quickly just hearing it. Dr. Proctor was great. Used to love his preaching. Yeah. Those are some of the greatest ones. I heard Dr. Sandy Ray preach When Faith Bogs Down. You ever met Dr. Ray?
No.
A prince of a man.
I think I want to close our interview time with what is in 40 years, what is your favorite sermon that you've preached? Wow,
now that's a good one. Hopefully the one I'm going to do this weekend. The one I'm working on right now. It's got to be my favorite. Strange thing. It wasn't on a Sunday morning. It was a Sunday night communion. And I dealt with that widow of Zarephath who says to the prophet, we are going to eat this and die. And I talked about don't make plans for your funeral. It is, she says, come on, look at the pathos in it. We're going to eat this whole cake. And she announces, and we're going to die. That's the death of hope right there. And I remember that Sunday night, how that blessed people to hold on. It's one of my favorites. Now, that thing is so funny. My communion messages are really some of my favorite ones. And it's not, as you know, in most churches, communion isn't the biggest service. Not like the old days, Sunday morning communion. Everybody came first Sunday morning. Right. Now we do ours first Wednesday night. Some people do theirs different times. Yeah.
So what is it about the communion service that's so meaningful to you?
Man, well, two things. Number one, I remember the ones in my childhood and how meaningful those deaconess in their white, their deacons in their black suits, white shirts, white ties, or red ties, depending on what church it was. Dad in his full pulpit regalia and the sacredness of it. I remember Pop Scott, we did our communion first Sunday morning. Pop Scott, First Baptist, did his. They baptized on Thursday and then served the supper. So the last Thursday night was baptism in First Baptist. First Sunday was communion. So the people who got baptized had their first communion the following Sunday. So he did that in the evening. He dimmed the lights. Oh, it was moving. It was drama, man. It was drama. So the memories of that. The second thing is, even though we're non-liturgical Baptist, holiness, Pentecostal, I do think we've got to rediscover some of the sacredness of the rites of the church and the ordinances. I despise how we have made communion almost an addendum to a worship service. So for me, the Christology, the theology, what it says about redemption, the soteriology of it, man, every first Wednesday noon and night is our communion service. And everything, the scriptures, call to worship, the homilies, all around that. I want to lift that. I preached one Wednesday night, where Jesus says, do this in remembrance of me. And I opened up talking about, in Reader's Digest, when we were kids, there was that section, my most unforgettable character. And here was Dr. Proctor said, every sermon has to have a relevant question. Here was my relevant question. Who could forget Jesus? And yet it's almost as if he pleads, don't forget me. Frank, he's begging, do this in remembrance of me. New translation, don't forget me. Don't forget what I've given. Don't forget what I've done. Don't forget who I am.
I certainly want to thank you so much. You know, it's amazing. I have as good a time in these interviews as anybody watching. It's just preaching. It's just the beauty, the genius of African American preaching. To make that text come alive in the lives of people, hope, to give hope. And you know, to always say that in some of the most debased and despicable circumstances of life, that the black church has risen with these flowers of hope and beauty and healing. It's just amazing. So yes. I want to thank you for being our very special guest.
Thank you. As soon as I get back, I want to have Patrick redo my resume, type this in. I may call him from the road. Say, tear up the old one, type this in. Type this in as the old preacher said, introducing a preacher. He said, our guest preacher today is here, and his office has sent me his resume. As soon as I get back home, I'm going to have him put it in my resume, which is like my resume.
Final word for the African American preaching, PhD preaching, either students, future students, or what word do you want to? I think that's the fitting way to close it. What word you want to share?
Sure. Thanks, Frank. Man, what an honor that is. Let me say three things. First of all, I would say hone your craft. We have been vested with the greatest privilege in the world. I know that sounds like preacher hyperbole. You know, that great line that if you are a preacher and you're offered to be king, do not stoop down to become a king. I believe that, Doc. I wanted to go into politics. I wanted to be a lawyer. I wanted to go to Congress. That was my goal. When the Lord called me to preach, man, that to me was the greatest thing in the world. So hone your craft. Everybody else deals with the existential. We deal with the eternal. Hone your craft. Secondly, hold on to time-honored preaching traditions. Stop trying to reinvent the wheel. Stop it. We follow in the steps of our mothers and fathers. Yes. They blazed the way. Right. They made the path for us. Yes. Follow that. Yes. Be creative, but don't become so novel you become trite. And the third thing I would say is keep your hope alive. No matter how, you know, that passage in Jeremiah, we all like to preach that part. Before you were born, I knew you. Before you, please, that ain't the best part. You know the best part is when God says to him, and don't be afraid of their faces. And I always smile because I said the only reason God said that was because they had faces to be afraid of. Else he wouldn't have said it. That's my hope. I know they're going to look at you mean. I know they're going to turn a deaf ear. Don't be afraid of their faces. And the only reason he said it was because he knew how their faces would look. Hold on to your hope. Even when it looks like you're not making a difference, you are. Because the promise is my word will not return to me void. It will accomplish what I sent it out to do.
Thank you so much, man. This is a blessing. It's just a blessing. So thank you for sharing this. We're going to get this out. This is just a rich word. So God bless you, sir.
Love you, bro.
Love you too.
You mean the world to me.
Me too. You're one of my favorite preachers.
Yeah, you know, you are one of my favorite. I want to preach like Frank Thomas when I grow up. Oh, I will do. I want to do it.
You're already grown up.
When I grow up, get a few more whiskers. My voice drops a little. I'll be just like Frank.